Good evening. I'm the poet Tony Curtis. On behalf of Brendan Flynn, Des Lally and the Clifden Community Arts Festival, the 43rd, I would like to welcome Sinead Gleeson and Elaine Feeney to this evening's event. And to you too. This event should have been taking place in the Station House Theatre, Clifden. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we have had to go online. So thanks to Sean McCairn, our tech man out there in Clifden, who's making all this happen. The strange thing is, I'm always complaining to Brendan about how far the front row are away from the stage. This is because of a fire break. It must be all of 10 feet. After this online event, where our audience are now hundreds of miles away, I will never make that complaint again. So to begin, I will introduce Elaine Feeney, and then she will read for a short while. I'll then introduce Sinead Gleeson, and she will read, after which we will have a discussion about their books and their writing lives. Elaine. Elaine Feeney was born in Athenry, County Galway, an award-winning poet, teacher, dramatist, novelist. Elaine teaches at NUI Galway and St. Jarlath's College, Tuam. She's the author of 3 acclaimed collections of poetry, all from Salmon. Where's Katie? The Radio Was Gospel, and the superb collection, Rise, a book that takes real gambles and goes to the edge of death. Here are poems that breathe, weep, yell, that rise to shake and shudder the house, the city, the hills beyond. Elaine Feeney stands with a fist in the river of Irish history, Irish literature, its treatment of women, their bodies, their minds. She digs into the legacy and trauma of the past. You can imagine Sinead O'Connor singing her poem Rise. It would be mesmeric. Like Sinead Gleeson, Elaine Feeney champions women and women writers. She already has a solid literary reputation. I noted in last Saturday's Irish Times, in a wonderful review of Darren Negreafa's new book, A Ghost in the Throat, Sarah Gilmartin said, with writing as strong as this, Negreafa more than earns her place alongside Emily Pine, Sarah Baum, Lucy Caldwell, Sinead Gleeson and Elaine Feeney. Just a few weeks ago, Elaine's debut novel, As You Were, was published by Harville Secker. I read the book last week in the west of Ireland, the very setting of the book. It is an extraordinary roller coaster of a ride. Poetry runs through the veins of the prose, dotted with text messages and emojis. The book opens with a 15-page prelude, Fishhooks, Superstitions. The main character, Sinead Hines, is telling us about what she did when she came out of the oncology unit. Oncology, the treatment of tumors. I didn't tell a soul I was sick. Okay, I told a fat magpie. She was the first beating heart I met after the oncology unit, and she sat shiny and serious on the bonnet of the Volvo. One for sorrow. As I said, from first to last, a seam of poetry runs everywhere through this book. We are introduced to Sinead Hines as a girl, a daughter on a farm who likes to read books, but her father, the ogre, he is stomping through the house, is saying, where is she? Come out wherever you are. Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell blood. Reading books somewhere, and she isn't sick, she's fine. In his hard head, books are a waste of time. Books are for those who are properly sick, indeed dying. But Sinead continues to read, borrowing, we are told, from her mother's stash, Vinci, Cookson, Wilde, then adding her own books, McGahern, Edna. Why is her father fearful of books? Well, as they say, books contain knowledge, and knowledge is power. It is not what he wants to pass on to his daughter. I loved the book. Like Lisa McInerney, I found it raw, sharp, wild. Like a novel by Dermot Healy or a poem by Rita Ann Higgins. There's a lot of sadness in the book, but it is also very funny. What did they say? Whistling past the graveyard. For me, the book was like an ambulance being driven along the old bog road in Connemara at high speed by a Polish immigrant with an Australian nurse beside him. The back doors are swinging open and the patients are all likely to lose their minds or lose their lives as they hurtle along. But they stop and pick me up and I'm introduced to a motley crew of characters. I hear stories of love, hate, courage, loss. There are songs, books, magazines, prayers, drinks, and television, histories of legacy and trauma. There are tears and laughter, lots of broken dreams, many regrets as you trundle along. And all this journeying centers around Sinead, the main character, the main patient, the 30-something mother with a terrible secret. The ending of the book is hauntingly beautiful, the last few pages being a prose poem to loss. So, Elaine?
Wow, thank you so much, Tony.
Sorry, a bit long.
That was poetry itself now.
Well, this is a beautiful book. I should hold it up, shouldn't I?
Thank you. I can do that because I'm going to read from it. Okay. It's
on the book, yeah.
It's lovely to be here this evening, and hi, Sinead. And just like to say a word to everyone in Clifden that have it's been a really tough time on the residents there, and I was really sorry to see the flooding and so on. So my heart is with you guys at the moment. I'm going to read a section from As You Were, Tony, that you spoke about via email with me, and it's a part where a character called Anne Hegarty, who's coming to, she spent some time in America, and I won't give away too much of it, but she ends up having to go to the two mother and baby home. And it's funny there where you spoke about the Connemara Road. I remember when I was a young child, my mother had an accident in Clifden and had to be taken via ambulance to Clifden into University Hospital Galway. And I was in the back of the ambulance with her. And I think something about that reminded me of when I wrote this piece, just it evoked something in me when I was writing this piece. But Anne Hegarty is from Clifden, and she's been driven into Tuam, into Galway and out to Tuam. So I'm just going to pick it up there. They say Anne Hegarty didn't stay long in Clifden after returning home from America. A motor car was called for her, and she was brought back into Galway, past the stone bridge at Uachtarard, thatched cottages and red doors, half doors. They stopped at the Anglers Rest Hotel, where her stubbly chauffeur, who had been quiet the entire journey from Clifden with the pregnant girl in the back seat, took her into the bar of the hotel for some Guinness. And after he settled her into the snug, the lady of the house brought out a large glass jug with 2 tulip glasses, and he poured. Anne was given a half pint, for he insisted iron was good for the baby, as he stroked her thigh, and sure he could do no damage. No more, anyway, he whispered. And he bought another large jug for himself after the first, before they both left in broad daylight. Anne was sickened from the Guinness pooling and churning in her belly, so she sat faint on a white garden seat outside the front of the hotel. And 2 young boys came over, offering her a basket of fish they had just caught. 5 silver bodies lay on some straw in wicker, fat and blue around the centre, dead and resting in the afternoon sun. 5 fresh jelly eyes, bulging and shiny, staring back at the young woman. They went on to Tuam, and her chauffeur drove on through the town and stopped his car out on the Athenry Road, a little way past the railway bridge, where trains brought sugar beet up and down the line. And then he told her she was on her own. If she wasn't up for anything, then why would he shame his car and drive her to the gate of the home? And abandoning her on the side of the road, he gave her scant directions to find her way back the route he'd just driven out. Up, he said, and into the right, I think. It was well dusk when Anne Hegarty made her way to the Bon Secours mother and baby home. Good help. Good help to those in need, Bon Secours. And it is said that sometime after the birth of a little boy with beautiful skin, Anne was flung in through the doors of the Magdalen Laundry at Foster Street in the city, driven back by the same chauffeur. And although rumour has it that she did protest, she'd serve out her time for the sin of sex, for no one would pay or could pay the £100 bounty or release fee for her, demanded by the church for her keep while in confinement. £100 to release her back to a life of hanging her head down or leaving for England if she could raise the fare and never return home. But how could an incarcerated woman raise a fare? a life of incarceration for Anne, as Bishop Brown and his army of virtuous brought down any good man or woman who sought healthcare for women. And was it only what was best? For what were women only donkeys? And what was a donkey only a working ass? And what was an ass but a fool? And what to do with a fool but stick her in the corner and point fun at her, make her your slave? And what of the child of an ass but an ass fool, and a chattel to sell or starve? Ah, and what of it? We should all forget it now. Ah, they were bastards. Malthus, indeed. And isn't incarceration only your own fault? And how we are all so convinced by each machine that replaces the last, that all lost ambition is to do with the self, regulation, impulse, self, live your best life. Everything is possible. Fight your illness. Come on now, hop off your knees. Christ. I'll take the applause.
We should have, in the football matches at the moment, they have fake applause. You know, we should have.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
We should have that. I hope you showed your book.
Oh, I'll do it now just in case. There's the book.
There it is.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the magnificent
Rise.
That's a great collection. Super.
Have you given this to Sinead O'Connor? You should.
No, I haven't actually. And she's mentioned in As You Were.
You should get her to sing it. And I'd do backing vocals.
If you can source that for me now, Tony, I'd be thrilled.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
Okay. Right, we'll crack on here now. Right, now I'm going to introduce Sinead. Sinead Gleeson was born in Dublin. She is an editor, broadcaster, essayist, fiction writer, arts journalist, and critic. Her short stories have featured in several anthologies, including Being Various, New Irish Short Stories, Faber 2019, and Repeal the Eighth. She has edited the award-winning anthologies, A Long Gaze Back, an anthology of Irish women writers, and The Glass Shore, short stories by women writers from the north of Ireland. Both were Books of the Year in the Irish Book Awards. On October 1st, her new anthology, The Art of the Glimpse, 100 Irish Short Stories, will be published by Head of Zeus. Her book, Constellations, Reflections from Life, a collection of essays that weave together into a magnificent, passionate book, is a remarkable piece of writing. Beautiful, strange, truly unique. She is a gifted, lyrical, clear-sighted writer, wonderful to read. I was given Constellations for Christmas last year. Having read the critics in the papers, I imagined I would be reading it through fingers. But somehow, Sinead Gleeson leads you through her suffering, transmuting, as the Observer critic says, her experience into something powerful that demands to be heard. I would have said demands to be read. With mince pies and cups of tea, I read the book in 2 sittings, and I read it again last week with equal pleasure. I felt the same about Emma Donoghue's novel, The Room, which, despite its subject matter, was equally captivating and beautiful to read. At the opening of Constellations, in an essay with a marvellous title, Blue Hills, Chalk Bones, you can imagine John Prine singing that. Sinead tells us that from the age of 13, she began to spend time in hospital because of persistent pain in her bones, followed by a diagnosis of leukemia, hip replacements, numerous medical procedures. Like Walt Whitman, I Sing the Body Electric, and Paula Meehan, imaginary bonnets with real bees in them. Sinead always has wonderful titles to her essays. I particularly like A Wound Gives Off Its Own Light, a line borrowed from the Canadian poet Anne Carson, and 60,000 Miles of Blood. You can hear PJ or Mick Cave singing that one. In the latter essay, Sinead says of one night in hospital, I have no memory of this, but my mother told me years later that I looked into her face and I said, I'm not going to die. I'm going to write a book. And then Sinead says this, to commit to writing or art is to commit to living, a self-imposed deadline as a means of continued existence. It has taken me a long time to write that book, and here I am, so very far from that awful night. Sinead drew on the courage of artists like Frida Kahlo, Virginia Woolf, who turned to creativity to endure and fathom suffering. At this point, Sinead herself now inspires. Sebastian Barry captures the essence of this, and I quote, "To remember sometimes is a great sorrow, but when the remembering has been done, there comes afterwards a very curious peacefulness, because you have planted your flag on the summit of the sorrow. You have climbed it." Rightfully, Constellations, Reflections from Life won Non-Fiction Book of the Year at 2019's Irish Book Awards. I give you Sinead Gleeson.
Tony, I think I should just get you to introduce me every time I have to do an event.
I was terrified writing that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for taking the time. That was a beautiful introduction. And I'm delighted to be at Clifden.
Yeah, you make beautiful books. Yeah.
Thank you. I love Clifden. It's a gorgeous town, and I'm just sorry that we're not all there together. And then the bookshop, I'm very fond of that bookshop. I can't pass it without buying a load of books. I probably don't need, but it's such a lovely bookshop.
Yeah.
So well curated.
It won best bookshop in Ireland.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, and it's lovely. And the two women who work there are just really lovely.
Yeah.
I'm going to read a little bit from you were asking about reading from the 60,000 Miles of Blood essay, which is again, essays are very interesting things that you can do an awful lot with them, and this is ostensibly an essay about blood, but it's about my blood, about other people's blood. It's about a leukemia diagnosis, but it's also about blood artists and performance artists and the history of blood, the religious connotations about DNA, all of those kind of things. So I'll read a little bit from this. This is my very tattered book that's gone all around the world. I mean, the state of it. It's onto its third dust jacket, I have to tell you. People ask for photos, and I go, "Can I use your one? It's a lot cleaner than this one." So, so this is divided into 8 sections, which is the rhesus and blood groups. This is from the A negative. If you take all the blood vessels in an adult body, veins, arteries, capillaries, and lay them out in a continuous line, they're said to measure 60,000 miles. Typing these words, fingers depressing keys, there's a movement of tendons across a pale landscape of skin. But what I notice most is the blue of the veins, each slim stream, a messenger of the blood, working away unacknowledged. Over the years, several cannulas have been attached to my arms, pre-surgery or when the veins at the elbow collapsed like a coal tunnel. And each time, a phlebotomist offers words as a preparation, but they're never the right words, always inaccurate about the sensation that follows. You'll feel a scratch or a nick, they say. It feels like neither. In my late 20s, 6 months to the day since I married my husband, I found myself in an ambulance on a cold, glass-clear January morning, a paramedic holding me upright because it was too painful to sit or lie on a stretcher. And later, in the home and chaos of the hospital, I was told that something of concern lurked in my blood. I hadn't suspected there was anything wrong until I found I could not bear any weight on my right leg. The throb and sear of it continued, and a doctor dispatched me to casualty, where I waited on a trolley in a tiny room beside 2 pensioners. That I was stationary for 72 hours now seems terrifying, given that the eventual diagnosis was deep vein thrombosis. A blood clot in my calf had slowed and coagulated into a blocked knot. Anticoagulants were administered in elephantine doses. Weekly visits to a warfarin clinic followed, an airless room where I sat among old women, a sea of silver heat-treated hair, the youngest person by decades. Warfarin comes in a trio of strengths and colours, pink the strongest, followed by blue and then brown. But no matter what colours I took, in rainbow combinations, my coagulation level bounced around like a skimmed stone on water. A persistent cough percolated in my lungs, and one day I woke to find my legs dotted with black bruises, more than 20 mottled circles. They weren't trauma inflicted, so they didn't hurt, and I now know that this phenomenon has a name, ecchymosis, from Greek and New Latin, to pour out. The colour frightened me. It wasn't recognisable as anything from the usual bruise spectrum, night sky, purple, pond green. Everything felt ominous. Night sweats woke me constantly, and it felt like there was worse to come. What was happening to me? With illness, there is always a sense of before and an after. The before time when everything is bright and even keel and normal, a word that loses all meaning in the face of disease. The final moments of before, just as it slowly dawned on me that bad news was coming, was when a haematology registrar, kind, blonde, about my age, used the word blast. Her reference wasn't to having fun, or Star Wars gunshots, or a wind gust that cuts you in half, but to myeloblasts, immature white blood cells that spill out from the bone marrow. This was a new word, and used in a medical context was enough to ping the synapses, to make me ready myself. I fished for answers, dropping a line into this new, terrifying water. The haematologist was circumspect, eventually admitting there was an irregularity in the bone marrow. Like leukemia? I asked. And in that moment, I don't know where that question came from, or how I made such a leap from bone marrow to cancer. But then, what did I know in this land of before? To be an undiagnosed patient is to be in a constant state of fear, of waiting for the revelation. Offering a hazard guess is an attempt to compute or accelerate the truth. And on that Sunday, it felt like weighing up the facts of my body. The black bruises and night sweats and chest heaving cough were coming from somewhere.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And you brought back the essay, because that word essay, when I think of the word essay, it just reminds me of, can I get an extension? You know, can I get an extension? 2,000 words on Coleridge. It's so you've revived the word. I now think of Sinead's essays, and they're fantastic to read. I hope you're writing another book with them. And
someday. I do you know that the word essay comes from the French to essayer, to try, and right. I think that's a brilliant interpretation of the essay, because for me the essay is a way of trying to figure out how you feel about something. So how do you feel about illness or death or mortality or Irish history or pregnancy or women? So for me, it's a way of kind of answering a question. So I like that idea that it's an attempt to try and figure out what you think and put it on the page. And the fact that it's an essay means essay to try just makes a lot of sense to me.
It appears nowhere on the cover.
Don't even get me started on that. I would have liked it there. Publishers have other ideas. That's all.
No, you see, they were terrified of people like me coming along and headbutted.
That's actually true, yeah, because essay reminds me of the Glenroe music on a Sunday night and not having my essay done. And actually, it has become a really vibrant word now, and it would be nice to see it on the cover of a reprint. I agree with Tony.
Great. You've recovered the word.
Yeah, totally agree.
Now I'm going to move into what I call our discussion, and this is completely new for me, because I don't like questions. So no, I just read. I talk to the audience and I read. If they want 20 minutes, I read for 20 minutes. If they want an hour, I read for an hour. If they want 2 hours, I read for 2 hours. But and sing a few songs. So my first question is: between the two of you, you write poetry, short stories, essays, journalism, drama, and novels. I know you both have very busy lives. So where do you find the time to write?
Sinead, do you want to start?
I mean, really.
One thing I found, Tony, and I don't know, you have a very much your career. Myself and Elaine, me plus Elaine would probably not equal the amount of time that you've been writing, but you have to be very committed to it. You have to believe in it, and you have to make the time and the space, and you do have to treat it like a job. And it takes all of us, I think, a lot of courage and confidence a long time to say that you're actually a writer. It's a weird word to have to say about yourself, because I do lots. I can't afford to be a full-time writer, and like most people, so it's one of the things I do. But in my case, I spent years not writing, and it was a combination of I can say time and busyness as well, but that was also before I had children, and a lot of it was fear and confidence. You know, it won't be any good, or who'd want to read this, or I don't know what I'm writing, or I'm a brilliant starter of things and a terrible finisher of things. So there's a lot of like half-formed sort of weird sort of Eraserhead type things stuck on my computer that I didn't finish. But I talked about it for years, and I talked to my husband about it for years, and he was saying like, great, you're going to do it, and finally you're going to do it, and I wouldn't do it. And eventually he decided that he would try some reverse psychology on me and go, you're not going to write that book. Which he said after was kind of deliberate, because he knew I'd be outraged. Like, oh, I'll show you. So I did. And again, see, in a weird way, it's a bit of a busman's holiday when you're a journalist, and that you're spending a lot of time writing. So then going off to write doesn't feel like the most enchanting thing in the world to do. So I cut back a lot on journalism, and I did other things like these kind of events and panels where you get to have the same conversation, but with the energy of an audience, which sadly we're not getting to have tonight. And I made the time. So Constellations was written a lot by getting up at 5 a.m, which isn't ideal and is painful, especially when your children are younger, but nobody's phoning you, nobody's ringing you, there's not much going on the internet, which is a terrible distraction for us all, as we know. But I came to the point where I thought, if I don't do this now, I'm never going to do it. And I really felt that this is my shot. If I don't prove I have the concentration and the continuity to finish this to the end, I won't do it. So there were many days, I'd say more days than not, that I didn't want to do it, that I found it really hard, that I found it difficult to go to the desk. But it only builds up paragraph by paragraph and page by page. And if you show up at all, and even if you get, your 200 words or 300 words, that's better than no words. And as somebody else better than me said, you can't edit a blank page. So even if you don't like what you did that day, and lots of days I don't like what I write, but I know I can fix it later, or I might ditch it, but it is, I think the key to it is.
I suppose for me, is similarly to Sinead, I suppose I wrote since I was very young, an angsty teenager, and it was a way I read as well a lot. Growing up in rural Ireland, and I felt quite isolated growing up. Books were an escape, and then I thought, well, I can put down my thoughts on paper. And, poetry was always my first love. I mean, I was just so drawn to it in school. It was one of those things that really spoke to me in the way that, I kind of froze in the seat when a teacher read a poem. And I was kind of bored at school a lot of the time, but, English was very, very interesting to me as a subject, and books. And then after I got sick, it's funny, so poetry was the first thing I went to, and I often wonder, is it because it was quicker and more immediate in a way? And it was an angsty political time before repeal and so on, and slam poetry was really, it was happening in Galway, it was a scene, and for someone with young kids, it was something that was accessible to me. And then when I got sick, after I was in recovery for a long time, and I remember, here, I'm going to be very confessional now because it's just the three of us. And I ended up having to go to therapy to get back to work, to be very honest with you. And I'm not ashamed to say that, but I remember what I was ashamed to say to the therapist at the end of the sessions after she, we talked a lot about mortality and so on. And I said, and I'm a writer. It was really like a big confession to her. And she was like, right. And I said, and I don't want to be. And she was like, why? And I said, well, it fills me with angst and anxiety, and it's tough. And she said, well, there are two types of writers. It just so happened that her father was a bookseller, actually. And she said, there are two types of writers, those who want to be, and I suppose those who don't want to be, but have to be. And she said, I think you're the latter. And I said, unfortunately, I think that's the diagnosis. So I came out anyway. And I remember very shortly after that going to Canada to a literature festival. And there were so many, it was a tour, and there were so many amazing writers. Raoul Zarita was one of the poets, and their bios were amazing. And I remember being introduced and this is Elaine Feeney. She lives in Athenry. She has two sons, Jack and Finn. And I swore on the plane back from Canada that I would write myself into a frenzy. And actually that's what I did do. I came back and I wrote a short story, and I sent it off to the Paris Review, which is snail mail, and I got a very nice rejection. And I just said, that's it, I'm going to take this seriously, because I can't not do it, so I might as well try to do it as well as I can. And that was for me. I don't know, I'm gone off the point, but the time comes when you just have to do it, I suppose. Like Sinead, get up early, go to bed quite late after all the jobs are done and so on, because I can't afford to be a full-time writer either. I don't think very many people can.
You made a big impact in Canada, because I was over there and researching a book, and I was in St. John's in Newfoundland, and the poet laureate of St. John's was George Murray, is that his name? And
that's right, and married to Elizabeth.
I was saying to him, do you know any Irish poets? And he says, I know Paul Dorkin. I says, and Elaine Feeney.
Oh, wow.
And I says, so there you go. You didn't mention
it. That's a fantastic place. So Irish.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Yeah, I wrote. I've been going there because I wrote a book about Image Man. That's the thing.
So hi to everyone there.
What has it been like, Elaine, publishing a new book, a novel, your first novel. What's it been like publishing in a pandemic? And I'll say the same for Sinead, with her. You have the new book coming out now in October, The Art of the Glimpse, as I mentioned earlier. Can you talk a little about those two books?
Yeah, so to publish in the pandemic, yeah, it was like, you know, you feel very self-indulgent to say it was hard, because obviously it's nothing comparable to what's going on in the world. And yet I think, like, you know, art is one of the most important things we have. And to me, books are everything, you know. So it was my launch date was changed. It was to be the 20th of April, and then that was postponed, and that was fine. And then you get kind of angsty and nervous because you hear that there's like a tsunami of books coming. 600 books are going to land on my head in August. And I suppose we're doing all this, we're doing a lot of Zoom and so on. And I like people. So I like actually the tactile, physical thing of meeting with people, signing the books, hugging, you know, shaking hands, kissing that. Well, yeah, but that's just me. So I suppose in that way it was hard. Yeah. But I'm really thankful to readers, and I'm so thankful to people who pre-ordered and ordered it and went out and got it, because, you know, that, and a book set in a hospital at this time, you know, I was a bit terrified about the theme of it. So, yeah. And
Sinead, was your book delayed, or?
No, I'm very lucky in that it wasn't. And I think that it's funny, it's only starting to land out in the world. So I have to show you this, because I keep joking to people saying it's a yoga brick, or you could murder somebody with it, because it's very substantial. It's a very large book, and you can see there's 100 writers in this book, like old and new, living and dead.
I think Elaine Feeney is in it.
Who's that?
I think Elaine Feeney.
Elaine Feeney.
Ubiquitous.
You know what, actually, because we're talking Clifden on the West Coast, Elaine's story, well, Elaine can tell you in a minute what her story is. I won't tell you for her. My book is out last year, and I feel very lucky that I got to go to lots, and I was reading in Shakespeare and Company and New Zealand and Manchester and Cheltenham and all these places, and I'm very, very sad for all of my writer friends, Elaine included, that don't have had so much of the wonderful events they would have done curtailed. So I've nothing to complain about. This book is still coming out, and it's full of 100 people that I really love and admire, and there's already lots of people interested in it. So it won't be we won't get to do some events. We'll do some events like this, but it would have been lovely to have the launch, to have so many of the writers in the one room. It would have been one of those things that if you'd had Hodges Figgis and dropped a bomb, you'd have wiped out half the literary world of the most champion. But no, I feel very lucky. I feel very sad for, you know, Elaine and Patrick Feeney and Creelan Hughes and all these people who had books out postponed, which make you're anxious anyway, and then your book gets moved and you can't do events or signings, and so I'm fine. It's others I feel bad
perfect
for, you know.
for Christmas. You know, great. It'll go out in wheelbarrows, I think.
Yeah, it could be, but I'd love Elaine to tell you about her story, because it's very connected to the West Coast and also to a very famous poet.
Well, actually, Tony, I think you're right. I think it's going to be the book for the Christmas fire, I have to say. It is a really, really beautiful book. Sinead, you're a superwoman, seriously. I really just don't know how you do it. I'm editing The Stinging Fly, and the poetry. And
I should guess the poet that it's about, shouldn't I? I should guess who the story is about.
Do you want to try and guess?
Yeah, I'd say it's Theodore Rusky.
No, but close.
Yeah, Theodore. I would have thought.
Very famous.
You're very close. You're close on the island.
Oh, Richard Murphy? No.
Yes. Well, it's actually, I did something absolutely, completely daft, Tony. Do you know what I did? Yeah. I wrote a loose first person Sylvia Plath, which I don't think anyone should ever do. Based around her trip to Boffin with himself and the kick, or whatever you want to call it, under the table. And I decided I'd write that. And it's called Sojourn, and it's about that moment from Plath's perspective. It's funny, actually, when I was writing that short story, I could deal with the beginning and the atmosphere and Cleggan and Boffin. I mean, I love Inishboffin. I think it's a really special place. And Murphy, and I could deal with all of that. But I remember the writer Claire Louise Bennett read it, and she goes, well, you deal with everything except what actually is supposed to have happened at the end. I was avoiding actually the scene where there's supposed to have been a little foot dalliance. So anyway, so that's the story. And what's nice about that for me is, I suppose, as you were, is very much, I think I have two writer voices. I think I have, you know, the poetry, the slam voice, and then I have this kind of other alter ego. Sometimes I call her Cynthia, but in Sojourn it's Sylvia Plath, and it's a much more measured, completely different voice. So it's nice to write it because it gives me a break from myself. So yeah, so thanks Sinead for editing it.
Into the house where Ted, the house Ted rented in Cashel out in Connemara. Yeah.
I haven't been, but have you? Yeah.
I have. I read there. I was reading there one night and I looked at the audience and I said to the audience, how does a 35-year-old poet get to have a house like this, right? Even to rent. I says, because my wife wants to know immediately.
But that's a bit like the Bukowski myths as well, isn't it? You know, like you hear that Charles Bukowski had all these women turning up at his door, you know, from all over Europe wanting to have a relationship with him, and no one has come to Athenry and knocked on my door yet, Tony. I don't understand it.
Now, I have another question. This is for Sinead. I said, were you surprised by the amazing response there was to Constellations, to the book? And what is it like to write so openly, so personally about your own life, your own suffering, your own joys and fears? You know, mother, father, everybody's in the book. What was that like?
Well, the first part is really shocked. I mean, the fact that I'm still talking about Constellations and doing things and hearing from people. I mean, most days on Twitter, somebody contacts me. It's had a long life, longer than I expected, this book. And one of the joys has been hearing from lots of people who felt like they needed to be heard, whether that was, you know, people who'd had children or not had children, a lot of sick people, a lot of disabled people, a lot of people who've had horrifying experiences with doctors, people who feel their pain hasn't been felt. I actually got an email today about two doctors who want to use the second mother piece, which is about dementia, in a book about dementia. Yeah. And a lot of people that's about dementia, but it's also about a very beloved godmother who never married and had children. And I've heard from a lot of women who are the Terry, you know, who are the women who didn't marry, didn't have children, who feel like they don't get represented in the culture very much, and that they feel like, oh, I'm the Terry, I'm the great auntie, that's me. And I love that. So yeah, I was surprised. In terms of the personal element of it, it's really terrifying. And for a long time, I did dither over parts. It's fine. I felt fine all the way along. And then it's when the proofs go out is when you get very nervous. And I have a very good friend who also has a hip problem. And she said to me, oh God, when she read the Blue Hills essay, she said, oh God, you're so kind of public and it's so private. And I had a moment of going, oh my God, what have I done? Because it didn't feel like that to me. But the first version of that essay, a wonderful writer who lives in Clifden a lot of the year, Siobhan Mannion. She's wonderful. She's one of my first readers and is brilliant. Yeah. And she read the first version of that, and it was much more about the church and politics in Ireland and very little of my story. And she said, everybody knows all that stuff. We all live in Ireland. We all know that stuff. We don't know this story over here about you. What are you doing? And she's like, you're literally hiding. And she was right. And she said, take lots of this out, leave it in, but there has to be more of you. And it was her kind of poking me in the back going, no one knows that story, and that's the most interesting part of it to me. So Siobhan encouraged me, and other writers do that all the time. And I say to people when I teach that if you're going to write about yourself, if you're not going to show up and be real and be raw, it's not going to sound real, and also the reader just won't believe you. They won't think you're authentic, and they won't believe what you're saying if you're kind of skirting around things, and you come close to it, but then you back away, and that kind of backing away can be sort of fatal. So it's difficult, but it'll be, the work will be better for it if you don't run away from it.
Yeah, what I like about your work, Sinead, sorry to cut in there, is that it's always outward focused as well. So while it deals with all of Sinead and all you've been through, which is huge, but there's so much else in it as well, like you said about Terry and you know, our mutual friend. And that when I read it first, and I can see Zadie Smith's Feel Free behind your head. She's another writer. Well, Zadie can bring in so many things, and I think you're that type of essayist as well. You touch on so much art and so much, you know, like just so intelligent. The essays are so intelligent. So yeah, sorry.
I reviewed a writer in the Irish Times last Saturday called Vivian Gornick, who's one of my all-time favorite essayists. She's an American essayist who's kind of doing, you know, she's quite old now, and she to me wrote one of the best books ever about writing non-fiction. It's called The Situation and the Story: The Art of Personal Narrative. And she said that a memoirist looks inwards and an essayist looks outwards. And I was interested in trying to combine those two things. I didn't want to write a memoir. I didn't want to write a book that was just about me. So I wanted to look at art and history and politics and other writers. And you know, science and loads of different things. And I think the essay is that form. I say it a lot. It's a very accommodating form, so you can do a lot with it. So I thank Vivian Gornick for that brilliant description of it, because it sums it up really well to me. I wanted to look outward at the world. I mean, we're all looking outward at the world, aren't we? So in you and your poetry, Tony, Elaine, you and your poetry and your novel, we're all looking outwards, even if we are looking at our own lives.
Yeah, I write to explain the world to myself.
Yeah.
I know that's why I write. I have a question for Elaine, if it's okay. I'll go to this one. I was wondering if you're superstitious, Elaine, or how superstitious are you? Because you have a magpie on the cover of your book. You know, I would be terrified to put a magpie. I asked you this because I'll tell you why I asked you. I asked you this because this morning I was listening to a podcast from a book show, trying to get in the groove for this, right? And I heard Maggie O'Farrell talking about her new novel, Hamlet, a book about the Shakespeare family and the death of the Shakespeare's only son, 12-year-old Hamlet. She said that over the years, she's tried 3 times to begin the book, but she couldn't let herself write it until her own son was older than Hamlet was when he died. In fact, she said even then she was afraid to bring that darkness into the house. So she wrote the book page by page in a dilapidated shed out in the garden. Would you, Elaine, would you relate to that, the power of words and what they conjure up? Would you be?
Well, yeah. Well, firstly, huge congratulations to Hamlet and to Maggie on winning the Women's Prize. But also, I'm beginning to think now, because the evening's drawn in, that actually I look like I'm in a seance in Tour Ballylee with Yates in the occult, and I'm afraid to get up to turn on the lights in case I knock over something. So apologies, this is not a dramatic setup, Lady Gregory style. But I'm absolutely not at all religious, and I'm so superstitious. It's ridiculous. It's to the extent that actually I have to work on it a little bit. So the magpie, you are so right. So there's a magpie on the cover. So I'm obsessed with saluting them, talking to them, making friends with them. So the editor at Harville Secker, they actually changed their logo. It's tiny there, and they actually designed a small magpie for me, 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, for the cover of the book. Which I like, that was the only way it would go to print for me. So I'm really thankful to them for that. Yeah, my grandfather had all those, you know, I think some places say pishogues. Here we always say pishrogues. And then I went to my good friend James Martin Joyce, and he had some very old dictionary, and he took it out and he said pishrogues is fine in Connacht with the R, and I was like, okay, that's great, if your Bible says that, it's okay. But my grandfather had all of those pishrogues. He only passed away recently, actually, during the pandemic. Not cutting down a fairy tree, not putting shoes on the table, throwing salt, all of them. And I think I don't know, maybe there's a wildness in the west of Ireland that we're very connected to pagan roots. And that maybe, you know, Christianity came in whatever, 431, 432, but like, we're still not really letting it in fully here, not down this road anyway. So yeah, very superstitious. And I do believe a magpie or a robin flew in while I was writing this week, and I actually put it on Twitter, and it sat on the couch over there. And I said, this is bad, isn't it? And the reaction on Twitter was amazing, because people were like, you can look at it in either way. Some people thought it was a really good thing, but you know, deep in me, I felt this is dark, you know. And yeah, very, very superstitious. And yeah, Sinead gets a bit of that from me in the novel.
And Sinead, our Sinead here, are you superstitious, Sinead?
I wouldn't say superstitious, but there's an essay in the book that I get asked about a lot, which is about my grandmother and my great-grandmother, and it kind of ties into what Elaine is saying, and that my granny and my great-grandmother were extremely psychic, and it runs down the kind of matrilineal side of my family. Women who can see ghosts. My grandmother used to be able to, I tell a story of her sitting, you know, coming home from work, looking over someone's hand of cards, the lads playing cards on the steps, and she told some guy he was getting on a boat the next day, and he laughed her, and then of course the next day he eloped, and his mother came banging on the door, and she said, well, what would I, you know, how could I explain that to you? So there's a lot of my family, and I've had a couple of kind of spooky encounters myself, and I'm interested in that because I'm a rationalist and I believe in science, and yet there's some things that I think are, you know, of a different kind of realm, especially if, you know, if you're somebody who uses your imagination and your head and you think about words and you spend a lot of time thinking about this, because we explain thing. And I like that sense of mystery in the world. Not everything is completely rational or black or white. And yeah, and yet I've met some people who are the most rational scientific people in the world who feel the same way, and the people who I'd expect to think like this don't at all. But I like saying we don't think this way. But I'm fascinated. Yeah, I'm interested in ghosts. There's a lot of ghost stories and supernatural stories in the art of the glimpse, which is deliberate because I'm really fond of them as a kind of genre. I always have been.
I'll just say when it comes to religion, I'll just say this now. When it comes to religion, they asked Samuel Beckett one time how religious he was, and his answer is sublime. He says, "I'm an atheist, thank God."
Well, it's a bit like that, isn't it?
So I always use that one. I'll just go on to say now, because I've written all these stories. I says Maggie O'Farrell uses Shakespeare as inspiration. Dear Nigrafa talks to the ghost of Eileen O'Leary in her new book. There is an extraordinary here Sinead talks about the tree who inspiration of the book Constellation. Will you talk a little bit about that page, Sinead, 189, if you have your book there?
Yeah, thank you for that, because you dropped out a little bit there, so I missed that.
Sorry, page 189. It's an extraordinary page, right?
Yeah, it's about obviously a lot of the book deals with sort of illness and the terrible things that can happen to a body and the disruption and interruption that illness is to your life. And I was really drawn to, so when I was a teenager and I was sick, and that was 13 to 17, a lot of surgery, a lot of time in hospital, a lot of time away from your friends. You don't really encounter any other sick people because people don't get sick when they're very young. I met other kids in the hospital, but none of them were the same as me. So I kind of I started to seek out when I was a teenager, people who had other experiences of pain and how they articulated it. And I found someone like Frida Kahlo who painted her pain, and somebody like Joe Spence much later, photographer who documented her breast cancer, people like, Anna Mendieta as well, who's a wonderful kind of performance artist and painter. But what I wanted to say about it is that illness can take over your life, and yet illness is an incredibly boring and mundane kind of thing. And I wanted to document it, but I didn't want to bore everybody to death in this book. I also wanted to say that, like, even terrible things that happen to you, like illness, and also like grief and bereavement, can be turned into something else. And I wanted, that's why I borrowed that Caroline, a wound gives off its own light, that the source of your suffering and your pain can also be the source of your inspiration and your work. And that's very much what I think is the nub of Constellations, is taking difficult things, and rather than letting them get on top of you or annoy you or have nothing have all that suffering, pain come to nothing, they did end up to something, because again, they made me think about mortality. And I've done a lot of talking about this book during the pandemic, which has been interesting, because a lot of people, for the first time, who've never been sick or been in hospital or gone to the doctor or had a needle or had any kind of a swab or test done, are now encountering that for the first time. Even if they haven't been COVID sick, they've been sick. And I think to have that, your cage rattled by mortality and illness, is not necessarily a bad thing, because it makes you look at what you do have, what you should be grateful for, that you are around, that you are able-bodied, if you are able-bodied, and that all the things, I think we focus an awful lot on what we don't have and what we're missing, when to be walking around, I think, in an able-bodied, fully functioning body with all your senses and everything working is a pretty magical thing, and most people don't actually get that or appreciate that. So this book is a bit of a reminder to take stock a little bit.
It's a fantastic. Why I love that page so much is what you say so simply is almost impossible to say. I mean,
I'm usually very long-winded.
But you make it very simple. It's beautifully put down. And the same now for Elaine. I said I must think in pages. I think because I write poetry, I only go, two lines a day, and I'm exhausted. So a whole page. And when I read your book, then when I got to the end, after I was in the ambulance as I visualized the book, I thought it was closest to my great friend Dermot Healy. I mean, I loved Dermot. I loved his book, but I thought yours was in that spirit. But I think there's in your book, there's lots of pages, but there's page 29, I think, is just, it's so revelatory of the book. And then suddenly I hit page 34 to 37. They're just fantastic piece of writing, absolutely raw, electrifying. A dear friend of mine lost a baby last year, a girl, and here was her story, word by word, getting sadder and sadder. I think the pages will stay in my head forever. They're just beautiful. But how do you write that?
Well, I suppose I'm after flicking to the book there to see what pages you mean. Now I know what pages you mean. I think women have a depth of experience, I suppose, that you can draw on when you write something like that. You know, I did, like, there were a lot of tears when I wrote this book, you know, and it took 4 years, and even that part, like, it was so much longer, and it was condensed. I suppose you write it from experience and from other women sharing their experience with you. And Sinead and I have had this conversation so many times about the coven of women, the way we have these conversations, often frantic, often out of the sides of our mouths. And I suppose I really wanted to reflect that in As You Are. I really wanted to reflect the camaraderie that women can share in the most vulnerable of situations. And obviously, there's two great guys on that ward as well, Patrick and Shane. Yeah. But in that very moment where Sinead loses her daughter, she's totally alone. She's totally alone with her diagnosis, and she's totally alone in that moment. And yeah. Women are totally alone in those pregnancy moments, no matter what, you know. Like, I was never a big fan of the "we're pregnant" sort of statement, so my husband would never dare make it. And he himself would say, you know, I was a father when the baby was born, you know, but for me, you know, it's a different thing. I think, you know, just with that shared depth of experience, I wrote it, and I really wanted to reflect the pain that women have gone through on their own, actually. And I suppose it's set between that time, between the marriage equality referendum and repeal, and that time, and I've said it before, where women had so much skin in the game to try and, you know, bring about basic fundamental human rights. And I wanted to say, this is your experience when you're alone and you're pregnant and it's a crisis or something is going wrong, and this is how it plays out, you know. And I suppose maybe I hope to elicit empathy of the reader, if that's not too maybe highfalutin type of thing to say. You know, I obviously love my readers and want to bring them with me, and I don't want to manipulate them in any way, but you know, I think this is a very important book for men to read, and Mike McCormack says that too.
Yeah. It is. It's a beautiful book for everyone to read. What was I going to say? You both write brilliantly about hospitals, doctors, patients, the naked or near naked body. You open this strange world to people like me who's never been in hospital. Hospital appears to be like a prison. It seems to strip you of your dignity, your clothes, your blood, your bodily fluids. And it even forgets your name, and you talk about that. How do you write about pain? I mean, how do you? Have I got my? How do you write about, you know, hospitals? How did you allow yourself to write about? I have this subject in mind. I'm going to write.
Sinead, do you want?
Well, in my case, it comes from a place of having spent a lot of time there, and when you spend a lot of time anywhere, you know, your eyes and ears are open, and I think there's such an oxymoron about hospitals, in that they are places where you go to get better, to rest and recover, and yet they're the opposite of that. There's a cacophony in hospitals. There's constant noise, constant interruptions. People are coming to take temperature, they're waking you up all the time, the cleaners, the breakfast, the doctors doing their rounds really early. It's really hard to sleep in them. There's one time when I was in, and I just kept hearing this noise, and it was literally like the telltale heart under the floor. I couldn't you know, phase it out. And I talk about them as kind of they're large kind of performance spaces. They're like galleries in a way, all those long corridors and white walls, but they're very anonymous. They're where you're staying. They're meant to be your home away from home, and there's nothing domestic or homely about them. I find them very alien places. I find them very lonely places. Again, you know, the fact that you're a chart number and you're not a name in a hospital, there's a real anonymizing that goes on with them. So they're really interesting to me for that reason. But I envy you so much, Tony, having never spent a night in one at your, I won't reveal your age, but you know, because I think anybody who hasn't darkened the door has been very lucky. And again, that's also, on the flip side of that, you know, you look at what our healthcare workers and all of the incredible health professionals, you know, cleaners, workers, porters, doctors, surgeons, lung specialists, epidemiologists, everybody's been doing the last few months. Where would we be without all of those people doing their best work? So while I do talk about some bad experiences, I've had a lot of incredible experiences, and I'm so in awe of all the work that again, medicine is altruism. You know, it's about trying to care for people you know nothing about, you're not obligated to, it's just your job, but you're constantly trying to fix or save or mend somebody. So I've always been fascinated by it, which is why I want the primary setting of medicine, which is the hospital. Yeah, but you're the perfect about it. You have a chapter in your essay in your book called "Does It Hurt?" 20 stories based on the McGill Pain Index. Yeah. Your 20 stories, I think that like in the middle of Constellations, there is this essay, and it really is a book of poems hidden like a small treasure in the center of the book, about your son called Washerwoman, an extraordinary electrifying poem about breast cysts, which I'd love you to read, and then another very funny poem about a impacted wisdom tooth. It has a wonderful opening and a really funny end, but it's a great poem. And I love the way Elaine talks about pain in her book. She says pain, it goes from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you know, 1 to 10. But normal person would go 1, 2, 3. But somebody who's been in pain it goes from 1 to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But that's a bizarre question. I think that question about pain, to number your pain. And I always found that really, really hard thing to answer, actually, because there's a subjectivity to it. And I think I realized I was a very sick child, much like Sinead, I think, and took to books. I saw it as a great weakness, actually, growing up on a farm in Ireland, to be sick. You were a bit like a sick sheep, you know, a sick yo. And my mother was never sick. She was a really healthy woman. And I think it's a very difficult thing to explain to somebody that you're not weak, but you're sick, you know. And I think I brought that with me, actually, all through my life. I almost see it as a failing, and that, you know, when I got sick, which was the inspiration for As You Are, is that idea, like Sinead leaves it to the very last minute. She collapses at home and has to go to hospital. And I had a similar experience. And I think, you know, I've spoken about it before, you never know the right time to bring yourself into hospital, because you're either too early or too late. But the numbering of pain is very strange to me. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I mean, it's bizarre, to be honest. But I suppose they have to have some record system, maybe. I think Tony, it's maybe what, and you might relate to this as a poet, that all of us are trying to do broadly in writing, but actually is a smaller, tiny microcosm is pain. It's like I wrote about pain because pain is so inexpressible. It's very hard to articulate, and I think that. Trying to articulate the inexpressible, whether that's, you know, no matter what your subject is or what your setting is or your geography is, and that's why I was interested in trying to write about something that's very hard. And as Elaine said, like I wrote about the McGill Pain Index because it's kind of meaningless, because my pain is going to be different to your pain, different. Pain is unique as a fingerprint, as I say in the book. So making it be between 1 and 10 is nonsensical, you know. But you see, if I had written those poems, I would just march out and read them. I think that so. I'll come to near the end. Just on a lighter note, have you to see where they are, what books they are beside on the Amazon algorithm, where your books have been their Constellations. The books beside it are all astronomy books. Parallel Worlds, A Journey Through Unknown Constellations, The Modern Scholar, Stars, Constellations and the Sky, Protector of the Realm, Supreme Constellations, The Path, The New Way of Thinking About Everything. I was thinking about your book. When your book, before it was a famous book, but when it arrived at the bookshop first, I was reminded of my friend Theo Dorgan. When Theo started writing books about sailing, when his book arrived in the bookshop, they never knew where to put it. Do you put it in the poetry section? You put it in the travel section. You put it in the, you know, the nautical marine yacht section. And he found his book, or his friends found his book all over the place. So I was imagining Constellations appearing in space and travel, science fiction, on the shelf with the medical books, the self-help books, biography, Irish interest, non-fiction,
before it won all the awards and was placed in the window or by the door. And Elaine, your book is
Go
great.
on.
Your book,
Tell
yeah,
me.
here you go. And this is like a page from your novel, or it's like it's like one of your poems. It says, as for Elaine, as you were, which I think the computer algorithm sees as a self-help book, as you were, because it is untamed. Stop pleasing, start living as you are. The gift of imperfection. 12 rules for life. The narcissist, you know. Make your own bed. Make your own bed. And best of all, decide Michelle Obama's Becoming. So now I would love you each to read a poem to finish, the way poets are. But
again, I need to point out something that
Sinead wants to read. But
I do not think
if you read a poem to finish, if you have your book
I don't
there.
think myself as a poet, because I'm on here with two poets, and I think of like those shorts. I think when people see blank space on a page and those pieces that you're talking about, the word is it hurt. I think of them as kind of micro essays and micro prose, because I don't have the skill of a poet that you two.
No, your poem, that if you read that, Breasts is just beautiful poem, and the poem for your son, because your book ends with a poem for your daughter, right? Yeah. But that poem for your son is beautiful. It's called Washer, the very first one.
Do you know, Tony, you're the first person to ever say to me that there's a poem in this book for my son. No, everyone focuses on the non-lettered one. No one's ever said that to me. Very stupid.
Would you read it for us?
And while Sinead reads, I'm going to run and get my poetry book because I didn't bring it to the table. One second.
I have it here.
That's so good to me.
Handed across the stage. Yeah.
So I should explain how this is structured. It's called Where Does It Hurt? And I explain the McGill Pain Index, which is 77 words in 20 groups, and you're meant to take certain amounts of words from different groups, so you end up with an amalgamation of words that sums up what your pain is, like kind of like an algorithm, if you like. Yeah. So the first set of the group one of the words are flickering, pulsing, quivering, throbbing, beating, pounding. So I wrote about a thing called Washerwoman's Brain. In his cot, my son so longed for is a white seal cub, soft with no edges, eyes a religious blue. Will they stay that shade? His clam knuckle skin shell grooves. I pick him up, this almost person. Notice a new pain in the wrist I don't write with. The source is tendon, not bone. Soon I cannot lift him or coax the milk bubbles from his belly by flattening my hand on his spine. De Quervain's disease, says a specialist. Or washerwoman's sprain, not washerman's. A reminder that it is women who wash, carry, feed, women whose bodies are the casualties of birth.
See, absolutely beautiful. Your son, when he grows up, he'll be really proud of that poem. Beautiful, beautiful.
He's 13 and very teenage now. It's the not getting a kiss at the school
but
now.
Still, at 13 is still like poetry, you know.
Yeah.
13 is a great age.
Yeah.
That's yeah, I read the children from junior infants up to PhD. So will you read a poem, Elaine?
I will actually. Will I read the Rise poem since you like it, Tony?
Yeah, I do. I love it. Yeah, and then maybe Sinead is listening in.
If Sinead O'Connor's, it's a bit longer than your win, Sinead. So sorry, I feel.
Okay.
Anyway, it's called Rise, and it's the title poem of the collection. Rise. Rise out of the ground, rise up out of bed, rise out of your sleep and wake the dead, arouse the living. Wake the nation, burn it, steal it, fuck it against the wall. Rise up and be counted. Rise up and say, tell me you didn't rise her. Tell me you kissed her madly on the lips, that you sucked them off her. Tell me again, blow into my ear. Rise up in a balloon, be a clown. Rise into the station, arouse the nation. Rise up off your head. Rise your voice in the gust, I can't hear your love. Rise your brother, tell him you're packing it in. Rise your mother, break her crystal. Scatter it on the path and watch it glisten. Turn yourself blue, be true. Put yourself into the seawater, surf the waves. Rise into them, ride out of them. Rise the red blush on your breast to your face, let it out of your head. Rise the love in your bed. Rise your husband. Rise her husband. Rise your boss and keep doing it. Make them earn you. Rise them out of it. Rise yourself into it. Rise the moon when it fades, even if you've to hang it of a prison cell wall with baling twine. Rise your son's interest in Picasso. Rise your son's interest in his father. Rise up to your envy and shift it. Rise the hay cocks. Rise the rowboat on the dock in the grey steel water. Rise the volume on the telly. Rise the baby in your belly. Rise the bread in the oven and watch it blow. Go again to the sunrise and scald yourself. Rise up your hand and answer my question. Rise up your hand and question my question. Question their question. Question your answers. Rise up and laugh. Rise out of your death. Rise out of your debt. Rise into your sickness. Rise another all night. Arise up out of the bog, but bring it with you in the grooves of your shoes. Let some fall from your steps. Leave a trail for your lovers, even in your head. Rise your hair and backcomb it, honeycomb it, beehive it, let them follow you. Rise your hand and protest it, rise your hand and protect it. Rise out of their shadows, ball it up and hock it back in their direction. Duel with your neighbour, but use a water gun. Let go, let fall, rise up and dance, let your father go. Fill your mothers out to the shadow of the earth and sing them. Rise up and birth them. Rise up and don't birth them. Rise your own flags. Rise out of their history books and into your history. Write it down yourself. Bring it with you, even on the back of your hand to remind you it's there, rising.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
Amazing, yes. And never apologise for the length of your poem. The poem is as long as it has to be, right? So that's it. So I want to say that it's been a huge honour for me to have the two of you here tonight, and on behalf of the 43rd Clifden Community Arts Festival, I hope it has been enjoyable, and I only wish we had been on the stage, because there would be a huge round of applause, and we'd probably have the Kane sisters with their fiddles, and it would have been magic. But I feel, see, the problem with this is I feel I'm just been talking to the two of you, but anyway. So,
that was absolutely super, and I want to say a huge thanks to you for your brilliant sharing, to Elaine, who's always great, and I love that poem, to Sean and everybody in Clifden, and I'm sorry we're not all going off for a glass of wine somewhere.
Yeah, same.
Great, yeah.
Tony, just before we finish up, can I just say though that this cave that you have for yourself looks really amazing.
Oh,
Your
yeah.
books.
All the books. I'm going to be Avalanche. Yeah.
Fabulous, fabulous. Thanks so much.